and today I'm delighted to talk to Chris, who's going to share with us a little bit about her journey of awakening. But I'm even more delighted that she's here with us because I would love to talk to her about the impact of trauma on our nervous system, and also just to chat about that in the context of awakening and why this part that is the body, the physical body, is such a crucial and important part of the journey of awakening that, at least in my view, has to be included. I can't imagine it any other way.
Mm.
So can we start with your journey, and just if you can share whatever you feel like sharing as to like when it sort of started and what it was like for you.
Yeah, so well, where to begin? Uh, for people who don't know anything about me, I've talked about this elsewhere, but I grew up in Halifax in Nova Scotia. So, interesting culture, it's like a lot of roots from the UK and Ireland and Scotland. You can really see that in the culture there, quite distinctly from the rest of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's a beautiful culture, very rich traditions and a lot of trauma too, a lot of generational trauma, right? So anyway, I was born into middle class family. My mother had actually been in a convent for about 7 years, from her age of 18 until she
Oh.
was 25. So this is like pre-Vatican II, when masses were in Latin. And her teenage rebellion was to, like, she grew up in a Irish Protestant home, and her rebellion was to become Catholic, to run off and become a Catholic nun.
I've never heard that take. It's usually the other way around. People rebelling against the Catholic Church,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
rebelling by becoming
yeah, yeah.
Catholic. That's incredible. Okay.
Anyway, I think it was very, very rough. That experience for nuns, like, they really quite a lonely and traumatizing experience, I think. Karen Armstrong, if you know anything about her, has written about her own similar experiences. So she had something similar, and has, written about it, um, quite vividly, what that experience was like. So anyway, my mother was, I guess, like, at the 8th year, I think they say you take your vows, she decided she didn't want to spend the rest of her life like that. So she left, and then met my dad, who was a divorcee, so it was even more scandalous, like the whole thing, and married my dad. And then, basically 4 kids came along. And I think that, our family was kind of like, probably, the garden variety level of dysfunction, no, I mean, we didn't have, like, serious issues like molestation or extreme stuff like that.
Hmm.
But it was the norm for parents to beat their kids. This is like back in the 60s. Very normal. Okay. And at school too, I remember that. So, it's, a lot of physical abuse and emotional abuse, emotional repression. And then growing up in the context of the Catholic Church, it's like a lot of guilt and shame kind of added on, that just for existing, is just enough, right? To feel guilt and shame that you exist, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Jesus died on the cross because of
yeah.
your, you
Yeah, yeah,
know,
yeah. I grew up Catholic as well, so yeah, I can relate. Although I was out of the church very, very quickly because, yeah, for all sorts of reasons. But anyway,
yeah. So anyway, I think what really troubled me about the Catholicism is, I kept kind of feeling like I could see the hypocrisy of it. Like, that's what really kind of bothered me. And I kept pestering my mother with kind of like lawyer like questions, like, well, what about this? What about that? Right. And and it was just, it just kind of baffled me, this whole ideology that, as long as you're Catholic, as long as you go to confession, you're going to be okay, And then everybody else, even other Christian families, were we're not going to end up in heaven because they hadn't chosen the right church. So
Yeah.
anyway, I got fed up with this. And by the time I was a teenager, just decided like all religion was, suspect. It was kind
Mm-hmm.
of like antiquated. And so I kind of like embraced science. Like I kind of took that on as I'm going to trust science to help me understand the world, right? Since I thought that would be, I thought I was going to go into dietetics, but didn't end up doing that. And got married fairly young and had 4 children. And, just kind of like, usual stuff, with married life, raising children. Um, and then what I would say is like it's kind of funny. Like you asked me when it all started. Honestly, I would say very early childhood it started in terms of I think I had like I think I was like a very philosophical child. Like I really was asking a lot of big questions, like why are we here? How did I get here? And I felt like the way that people looked at the world, I felt like there was like almost like everybody just assumed that the way the world appeared was not to be questioned. And for
Mm-hmm.
some reason, I remember sitting in like grade 3 classroom and looking out the window and just feeling kind of very alone, feeling like I know that there's another reality here. I know there's something more real than what like the consensus is about what this is. But I felt like I cannot even broach this topic. I wouldn't even know how to put into words. But it felt like I felt kind of isolated by it. Yeah, so by the time yeah, I think I got into my early 30s. I always had, I don't know, it was kind of almost like a premonition, if you will, that at some point I was going to put all of my attention on this thing called spirituality. And I just didn't know how that was going to show up, but I had that very strong, right? From, I think, it's hard to say when it really began, but I can remember it even clearly, like in my 20s, just feeling like, I feel like I'm so busy with life, but I feel like, all the things that are kind of consuming me, the day will come when I can set enough of this aside that I can kind of like put my attention on like these philosophical questions, right? It wasn't like joining a religion or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of like looking into what is this life about? And it felt so compelling. It felt like the most important question for me to answer in this lifetime. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, what happened is in my 30s, what happened was um, I got into a 3-year period where it just kind of started that I could see in myself, in my family, in people around me. I started to kind of like observe suffering, so suffering that had been just kind of like glossed over, overlooked, but it started to kind of come at me in terms of like I couldn't hide from it. And then this is like, you're maybe too young to remember this, but you remember the thing about the Romanian orphanages? Like this was,
Yes.
all right. So this was like a really big thing in the news, and
Yes.
this really captured my attention. And then it was just kind of like that was kind of like where I started to realize like, wow, like the magnitude of suffering in the world, and then all the conflict in the world and the senselessness about the conflict. I was seeing the suffering and conflict, both like on the international scale and kind of on the family scale, and the conflict in
Mm-hmm.
interpersonal relationships. And I had nothing to kind of like make sense of it. I had no framework to kind of like understand it. And it just became very nihilistic very quickly. It was kind of like, is all of this like this pointless suffering, all of it for nothing? We're just here to live this human life, and there's suffering, and there's not even a meaning behind it. There's no purpose served. There's no help for it either. Like there's no help. There's just things are terrible and there's no end in sight. Yeah. And and during that 3-year period, I had a brother who had become schizophrenic in his late teens, and may have been triggered by cannabis use, but maybe there's some genetic thing possibility
Mm-hmm.
too. But anyway, in the midst of this 3-year period, he died in a drowning accident. And that just, that was like part of this 3-year crisis as well. And I had like kind of like generalized anxiety, panic attacks for, thank God, brief period, but episodes of pretty bad depression, all while trying to raise a family. And
Wow.
it was really, 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 really tough. And I have so much empathy for people who struggle with mental health challenges. I really do. When you've suffered like that, it gives you a different perspective of you know mental health issues. So kind of like towards by the way, I managed to, I decided I'm not going to go for medication, and I would go to the library and I got books where I read up on like how to do cognitive behavioral therapy on yourself, and I made myself get out and jog, even though it was like the last thing I wanted to do, but I managed to dig myself out of it. And then it was kind of like on the heels of that that I met somebody, and that person really changed the course of my life. And that was, it was a woman who came from Long Island. She grew up in a secular Jewish home, and then somehow got into kind of like a cult-like group of like Tibetan Buddhism for 25 years. And I just met her at a book discussion club that I joined. And when I came into the room the first time, this is like, maybe five or six people there, but I could immediately, it was like a transmission. It was like I was coming into contact with something that was just, it just, it was kind of like this incredible sense of peace and silence. And I knew it was coming from her. And it was just like, wow, what, and she was like a very humble person. Um, uh, they were discussing Rainer Maria Milke's book, one of his famous books on poetry, I remember. But
Oh,
anyway,
Rilke? Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And anyway, um, we quickly became very good friends, and she's the person that introduced me to Buddhism. And she wasn't trying to kind of like sell me on Buddhism, but because I was asking her questions, she was sharing with me a lot of the basics and did a beautiful job of it. And we started going to talks where people would come to Montreal. She was no longer, by the way, with this group. She had spent 25 years with a let's call it a sect, and
Mm-hmm.
then left realizing that, it had culty stuff going on. But, she said, like in spite of like the issues there, she had gotten something out of it. And I think to this day, she was really quite highly realized. Although back in those days, one didn't talk about this. It was a taboo, right? You didn't talk about any, you know, level of realization. But anyway, what happened is we became really good friends. She became a dear friend of the family. She was like an aunt to our children, and such an inspiration. And then like she ended up getting sick with cancer, and she died within a year. So we were friends
Wow.
for, I think maybe about 8 years, something like that, 8, 9 years. And it was like the loss was like devastating. It was like almost like losing my husband, because she was such an important figure in our family. And yeah, it was just a really, really big loss. And before before, like in the months after her um, diagnosis, she had said to me, Chris, why don't we go to a silent retreat together? And so she started kind of researching and trying to find a retreat that we would go to, like a 10-day silent retreat. But what happened is the cancer progressed to the point that we couldn't go. And then when she finally passed, I decided I'm going to do it. I'm going to go. And so within 4 months, I went off to a 10-day Vipassana retreat in rough mental shape. I was still grieving her quite a bit, and my capacity to concentrate was pretty poor. And I went off, and I remember like in the beginning days, you sit there with the instructions to put your attention on the breath. My mind was just so distracted. And my emotional state was such that I know like a whole hour would go by, and maybe 3 or 4 times I would remember to come back to the instructions, and maybe after 10 seconds it would be gone again. So it was just, that was just the way things were. And yet, like in the environment of the 10-day retreat, right? I don't know if have you ever done one, a Goenka retreat?
No.
it's almost like doing an ayahuasca retreat, I think. Like it's just a very intense experience that, it's just putting you in a place that is just like nothing else. 10 days of silence and like 9 hours a day of formal meditation. So, something happens to the mind when you get into an environment like that with that amount of meditation. The mind calms down a lot, and just from not talking, it will quiet down a lot too. And so with that, like relative, inner quietude, there's a possibility, that comes forth, and it did for me on the 8th day. And I was sitting in the hall, and my mind went completely silent. And it was a kind of silence I'd never experienced before. And honestly, like a fear washed over me. It was because it was like so unfamiliar, and it was like, what's happening to me? What's happening? And then I somehow was able to kind of like calm myself and go back to the meditation. And I think like within a minute later, it started again. And this time, like it was like a big fear reaction. Angela's spoken about this. I
Mm-hmm.
just talks about it. It's a real thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I could see how for some people, it could really become like, panic attack, if you don't have the skills to calm yourself. But the second time it came, I somehow was able to just stay with it. And that was it. That was it. That was like the first shift for me. And it was like a pretty big shift. I didn't even know that what it was. I had no understanding of what had happened, but I knew something pretty big happened. I assumed it was happening to everybody in the room.
Yeah.
Didn't know it was just me. I thought everybody was having this. Um, anyway, I went home, and it was just man, it was just like heaven on earth for 3 months. All reactivity had just kind of like fell away. All feeling of resistance fell away. I was so happy, happy in a way I'd never been in my life. Um, just, just like overflowing with a feeling of peace and joy. And I remember saying to my husband when I came home, I said, listen, if this had cost us $10,000, it would have been worth every penny, you know? In a short time, I guess like people around me were like, impressed enough. Like there were 12 people that in my circle that went off to do Vipassana
Really.
because yeah, because like they were like, wow, what's happening with Chris? Just
I've been hearing about it more and more because I've been meeting different people and everything because I've had none of those experiences with any kind of spiritual communities, any kind of even spiritual retreats, nothing like that. So
yeah,
it's fascinating that this particular retreat that you're speaking of, it's such an intense experience for so many people and so many powerful shifts happen there. But yeah, please
yeah.
continue.
Yeah. So anyway, so I had no idea what this was. I just assumed everybody was going home from Vipassana like this, right? And so the next 3 months went by, and it was just like heaven on earth. And then it started to slip away. And it really hit me hard because I didn't think that that was possible. I thought this was permanent, and I had nobody to really talk to. And within like 3 months, not only was that, blissful state gone, but it was now replaced by a depression. And I went to see we had locally a family physician who was actually the director of this center. And I went,
Really?
yes. And I went,
Wow.
and I sat down with him. I didn't call this awakening, but I said, this is what happened. And this is what I'm just feeling really not good. And he said, he was really good. He said, you know what? I think you just go back and do another 10-day retreat. He said, I think you're going to be okay. And I did. I went, right away, and it did clear up the depression. I never had a depressed day after. So that was good in the sense that it cleared up the depression. But the problem that ensued for me is the way this awakening will typically unfold for people at this stage of things is it's like a natural purging process gets underway.
Hmm.
Repressed emotions just want to come up. I didn't understand that. I didn't know that was what was happening. And because I'd had such a big experience on the first retreat, I felt like if I just keep going to enough retreats, I'll get that back. And so I kept going to retreat after retreat after retreat and serving courses and getting really involved, very committed. I just felt like I'm going to do this for the rest of my life, you know? And what was happening was I was actually making myself more dysregulated because I had this emotion that wanted just wanted to come up and be processed. But sitting in a formal meditation posture, that's not the way to process, that's not the way to do emotion work. You know that. And so what was happening is I was, because of ignorance and lack of the support I actually needed, what was happening is I was managing my state through meditation. I think this is really common. I think
I
that's
think
happening.
this is extreme. Because I'm seeing, it's so funny that I'm seeing so many people coming from no background, like that. I'm seeing people who have gone through these things, and it's been so fascinating to see how something so wonderful like meditation or whatever technique, whatever practice can be so freeing on the one hand and massively opening, and
Mhm,
or it can trap
mhm,
and become the sort of way to just control the experience rather than be
mhm.
in the
Yeah.
experience. And I even heard someone speak about certain meditators that are so good at those practices that they can even be with the emotions, even disturbing emotions, but it's still not really being but it gets so nuanced, and
Ah,
it takes a
yeah.
really good teacher to really know when someone is actually still not really being with the experience, right?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's I think and also, within the Buddhist community that I belong to, the way they speak about, emotions is kind of like they're like defilements. So you have shame around even having these emotions come up. And I had this experience that I had, a recurring experience was in the early days of many of the retreats that I went to, I would arrive at the retreat and within 24 hours, it would just be like I would be engulfed in shame. And the mind would pick that up and be searching, like, why am I feeling this way? And, trying to find a reason for it, right? Looking in the mind and feeling like I must have done something bad. There must be a reason why I feel this shame, and then shame about the shame. And I had like and it was just like not going anywhere. Um, so man, there was just like so much confusion around this. And I think in my case, what happened was eventually, oh yeah, no, and a lot of energy gets released too. So I started to have more and more energy pooling in the upper body, had crazy TMJ develop. So I always had some TMJ, but
What is TMJ?
it's tension in the jaw.
Right.
And it can get so bad you need surgery. You can damage the jaw joint. You can do a lot of damage to your teeth grinding at night. And this was actually getting worse on retreat. And I am aware that this is a problem in even with teachers and in, kind of known communities, that this problem is there because like we can have like Kundalini energy come up. We can have energy that's kind of released in the body and it's just not cycled, right? So it's just pooling in the upper body and wreaking havoc. People can get like really big problems with headaches, for example, pressure in the head, this jaw issue that I had, like just so it can manifest in a few different ways, but it can create a lot of suffering.
Really? So the jaw issue is very common, you're saying?
Yep. Yep.
Wow.
And I was, my dentist was saying, like, look, Chris, there's like, you're really damaging your teeth from grinding at night. And in the Vipassana approach, like, it's like all about stay with the technique, just keep doing the technique and try to have what they call equanimity, which is like, be okay with what suffering is there. And man, I'm telling you, I did my darndest to have equanimity around this. Like, it would just be the pain around it was kind of like having almost like a throbbing toothache, and you're trying to follow the instructions, like, all right, the pain is here and I'm going to endeavor to just not react. I'm going to endeavor not to react. And so like that really became the practice, was to try to be okay with the pain around this. And at this point, I would just say that, you know, it's almost like, if you think of it like this, it's kind of like you're walking around and you step on a piece of broken glass, and you continue to walk around on the piece of broken glass and try to be okay with it, rather than sit down and pull the damn piece of glass
Right,
out. Like, it's just
right.
like, given what we know, right? Um, and I've I've spoken to Angelo and other people about it, how, we have these beautiful, beautiful, rich traditions of Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. It's amazing. It's a treasure we have this.
Mm-hmm.
But it's astounding that given the richness of these traditions, that we have almost nothing useful on emotion work. It's a staggering, you know, um, like in its absence, right? It just doesn't make sense. And I think this is one of the things in more recent years that is, I'm really happy to see, like, this is one of the big changes we see in the contemporary non-duality world, is we're really turning and facing this overlooked issue. Well, let me just say a little bit more about my Vipassana years, because
Yes.
what actually did happen was I got to be, I would say, pretty expert with the technique. I was getting into jhanas and all kinds of advanced, really extraordinary states with this. And I had this kind of notion that if I just get into one of these states, long enough, the liberation will be on the other end of it. It was just this fantasy that I had, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, a similar thing can take hold with people sometimes with psychedelics, where if I just keep working with the psychedelics, eventually, you know, that will be it,
It will stick, or yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that everything will, so, all of the need to do anything more will fall away. Realization will be complete. And I had that fantasy with meditation, and then what happened is, when you're going through a process like this over years, you get to know other people, you become friends, and so you're observing other people too. And part of what really contributed to doubt was just observing people and going, wow, like, this person's really all in, and yet, like, I'm looking at them, and it was like really clear to me there was a lot of ego, and that they did not have healthy relationships. Their marriages were falling apart, their issues with their kids. So there was like, it was like, wow, if this technique is so great, like, why are these people, first of all, they're not doing well either, they're deteriorating in terms of their mental health, and their families
Wow.
aren't doing well. And then looking at myself, I was like really perplexed as to the level of reactivity that I still had. And after 14 years, I felt like, this doesn't make sense. I can sit down and get into extraordinary states, but reactivity is still pretty much untouched. And that was just like obvious to me. Nobody was talking to me about that, but it just felt like that doesn't make sense. Uh, and then what happened is, the will to keep meditating just fell away. I
Mm-hmm.
I would go to sit and do my 1 hour sit, and I couldn't get into it. And at first I felt like alarmed. I felt like, oh no, like, because I still had the idea I'm going to keep doing this somehow, because I had no other hope. I felt like I'd had such a big thing happen, life-changing thing back in 2001. And even though it was 14 years later and I was still struggling, like, it was the only thing I knew, right? And so I didn't know, there was nothing else that knew to explore. I didn't know anything about the contemporary spiritual scene outside of Vipassana. It's a little bit culty like that, they tend to kind of, like, in their languaging, try to encourage people, don't look outside of Vipassana. I think it's different now. They can't really control like that because of YouTube, but it was like that.
That would be a red flag for me straight away. Any
Yeah.
teacher or any group that discourages exploring other teachers or other traditions, that would be a red flag for me straight away. Yeah.
Even other Buddhist Vipassana groups was taboo. Like like you would be questioned if you can't return for a course. Like, have you done a retreat elsewhere? And if you said yes, but it was another Vipassana tradition, I'll tell you, like it was weird, you know.
But what's it? But I don't know. What is the issue? Why do you do?
Preserve, well, like it's ostensibly about preserving the purity of the teachings.
Right. Okay.
But it gets
Moving
weird.
on.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
So,
great.
so here's the thing is like when I finally the will to keep meditating fell away, what happened is uh pretty quickly I went through what I would call like another shift. It was very, very spontaneous. It was just like a spontaneous mystical experience, which I kind of like refer to as kind of like a second awakening because it had a lot of some of the same characteristics, but more of identity was seen through. And I could see how I could see how I had these beliefs that, for example, I'm a good person because I'm vegetarian. I'm a good person because I have left leaning political values. I'm a good person. So I had, and I could see how the ego wanted to stabilize itself by having something to feel supported. Well, at least I know who I am because I have good values, right?
Right.
And something happened there with this second shift that I felt like, oh my gosh, like I didn't see how I'm imprisoning myself with these notions, like these beliefs. And I could see how it doesn't matter whether you think you're a bad person or a good person, it's still a trap, you know? And for a while, it's kind of funny now in retrospect, but I almost felt like I was coated with Teflon in the sense that I could see like one of those, habituated thoughts or beliefs coming up. And it was almost like it would just like slide because, and, and I felt like I'm not getting trapped by this again, it's like, but anyway, it's kind of cool. But it was kind of interesting that when I stopped the formal meditation, I would say that's when let's say the awakening process really got going again. Interesting, huh?
Isn't that ironic, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like the next thing that happened was I kind of like heard about this whole non-duality. Like I didn't hear about the word non-duality until then. And suddenly like I was on YouTube voraciously learning about what's this thing called non-duality. And it was like the word itself just like I have to find out what this is. Like this sounds, like what I need. I didn't even know what it meant yet, but it was just, I'm going for it.
Yeah.
And in our life, my husband now, we had 4 adult kids, and one of our kids was struggling with a pretty horrendous drug addiction. And that was kind of all consuming for my husband and me. And we spent several years sending like, trying to support him. He would go to rehab. He went to rehab like 8 or 9 times. He was relapsing a lot. There was like a lot of stuff that was going on, and it was like a truly desperate situation where kind of culminated him in the ICU on life support for
Oh, wow.
6 days. He was in the hospital a couple of times, and it was just really extreme situation. Interestingly, the thing is that my husband and I both came to have a very, very deep gratitude for this child who caused us so much grief at the time, but we felt so much gratitude for him because what we came to see, if we hadn't had the struggles that we had with him, that for both of us, our own awakening process, because his had started in his 20s. Again, he didn't know it. I didn't know it. But for both of us, we came to realize that through helping our son and kind of learning stuff about trauma, generational trauma, and all kinds of stuff, that it helped us both immensely in our own awakening process to kind of get unstuck,
Wow.
So really
What
interesting.
a powerful teacher your son,
Yeah,
huh?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So one of the things that came up, well, first, I heard a psychiatrist on the radio one day talk about a plant medicine named ibogaine, and that literally represented like the a big turning point for our son. So we had a health professional come to Montreal who treated him, and it gave him enough stability that he could start to do therapy and emotion work. Okay, so I like it, and it opened my eyes too about plant medicine, because in the conservative Buddhist world I had been in, like any of these substances were just harmful drugs, in intoxicants of that were harmful, right? There was no therapeutic value at all. And then I was really, wow, was I ever wrong? That was a belief that I had that was like completely removed. And then it was learning more about, okay, now that he's got some stability, now we have to really move in terms of getting to the underlying issues that, set him up. And I was really, really lucky in the sense that I reached out to Scott Killaby by email, because I'd seen him interviewed by Rick Archer. And I told him about our son, and I said, look, we can't send our son to your treatment center, but can you give us some practical advice? And maybe we can put some stuff together here in Montreal. And he had one of his therapists call me and talk to me on Zoom for free for an hour and a half. And probably at least an hour of it was telling me about trauma and how trauma is related to addiction, and mental health issues. And that at Scott's treatment center, they had a psychologist who had trained in this modality called TRE, which stands for trauma releasing exercises. So this therapist said to me, he spent a considerable amount of time explaining to me, I'd never heard of it before, but he said, I recommend you find a video online, try it yourself, and then get someone to show this to your son. Try to encourage him to do this every day to get his nervous system regulated, because he said what's going on right now is his nervous system is so dysregulated that he doesn't have any measure of control. That's what's causing the relapsing. So I did exactly what this person said, and I found this old video online for $20 of David Berselli teaching this in 2004, and I tried it. Not thinking I had trauma. Okay, I had this belief that I didn't have trauma because I had ideas about trauma, that I had this idea that trauma is a belief. There isn't really a thing called trauma, but it's like a a belief that somebody takes on, and then they become like they buy into.
Victimhood and that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah.
And I really had I was like totally ignorant on the topic altogether. Okay.
I can relate to that part big time. Yeah, I had to eat several humble pies. Big time. Yeah.
So anyway, I didn't know anything about the nervous system. I didn't know about the symptoms of nervous system dysregulation. I was like really, and this is in spite of having, read a fair amount on addiction. But this area of it, I really didn't know anything about. So it was like really kind of like opening up a new world to me. And so I tried TRE. First time I tried it, I was like on my own at home. I went through the exercises, and it was like, wow, this is really interesting. It's strange. It's kind of like a strange experience in some ways. I wouldn't say it's unpleasant, but the first time you do it, you go through these exercises, and then you get this like involuntary shaking mechanism that really seems becoming deep in the core. It's like, first of all, you didn't even know your body had the capacity to have this shaking. It's not like it's kind of like an entirely new sensation. And but it wasn't anything unpleasant. It was just like, wow, like how did I not know this mechanism was here? And so then I thought, well, like my intention doing it the first time was what this person had suggested for my son was like, just try it once so you know what it is. And he said, you probably don't need to do it. And so I thought, yeah, I don't have trauma, right? So after the first experience, I thought, well, that was kind of curious. Like maybe I'll do this one more time. And so the next day I did it again. And this time it kind of really landed on me that, man, there's something about this that is like, I just kind of intuited, like, I have to work with this. This is kind of like pretty interesting. And the intuition is like, it's exactly what I need. And when I stood up from that, it was pretty remarkable. I actually had a pretty powerful chakra experience, and it was undeniable. And that kind of like really kind of like grabbed my curiosity too. Like I wouldn't kind of like make too much of it, but it was just like an interesting phenomena. And for me, like the severe TMJ, I was planning to spend $5,000 to a dentist for treatment for this. In 2 weeks, the TMJ was gone. Gone.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's incredible.
Yeah. Not only was it gone, but like so much of like the energetic stuff that was going on in the head area, the neck, the upper shoulders, like there was just so much. And I mean, it was just like astonishing, like in 2 weeks' time to have that gone. I'll tell
Just
you,
from learning for $20
it cost
online
me
at that point?
$20. It cost me $20. $20. I was astounded. I thought, like, how come everybody's not talking about this? How come my dentist doesn't know about it? Like, it was just like, and I could see that, like, there was something beyond just the tension going away. I could really sense that there was something kind of very global that was going on. Like, I could feel myself becoming, something was happening, something was shifting in how it felt to be me walking around, and I knew that this had a lot of potential for me. So I kept going with it. And one thing I'm really grateful for is I think about the 2 week mark, I was just so blown away that I'd never heard about this. And I felt like I was a fairly well-informed person. And I went online and I found a phone number on the west coast of Canada to do with TRE. And I called, and person picked up the phone. And I just felt like I just kind of like blurted out. I said, "Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm in Montreal, and this is what's happened to me." And I just like spent like 10 minutes saying everything that happened. And the person listened patiently on the other end, and then she says, "Well," she said, "You know what? She said that's really interesting." She said, "This is not uncommon, like what you've seen, but," she says, "it's more typical over several months than in such a
Sure.
short
Yeah.
time. But great that you've had this." And she says, "You know what? We're going to be offering a facilitator training in another 3 months. Why don't you consider going?" And I thought, well, maybe, okay. Oh, well, okay. Why not? Why not? This seems such a interesting thing. Why not go and learn about it at the very least? So I started flying out to British Columbia and doing the facilitator training over a course of a year. So glad I did, because it gave me kind of like the more theoretical understanding of it, which really helped to kind of carry me, through, sticking with the process when, let's say, a lot happened in the short term. And then what often happens for people after, some weeks or months is you might feel like, well, I probably got everything I'm going to get out of it. And then maybe there's not really any point to keep going. This is not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
Thing to know about TRE, if anybody's listening to this and curious, what I would say, you're probably going to notice something after the very first session. But this is like a medium to a long-term commitment if you really, really want to see what this can do for you. Because here's the thing, most people don't have PTSD, but most people do have layers of trauma from a variety of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really the case of you don't know what you don't know. That's really true with trauma. Like, you don't know how trauma impacts you. And I really love how Gabor Mate, do you know who Gabor Mate is?
Yes, yes, yeah.
I love the way he puts it. He says, trauma isn't about what happened to you. It's about what's happening inside of you now as a result. And I love that. It's like, like, put your attention on how you're functioning now. How are you showing up in life now? How are you functioning? Are you reactive? Do you have a lot of chronic tension, and you don't understand why? How are you in relationships, right? What do your relationships look like? Um, how, if you just kind of like give yourself 5 or 10 minutes to just sit with no distractions, right? And not meditate, but just kind of just sit there and go, all right, how does this feel? How does it feel to simply be by myself with no distractions? right? On a physical level, on a mental level, how, what does that show me? Like that, I think that's a really good way to kind of like try to kind of get a sense of yourself where things are, if you have any doubt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to kind of see how easy is it just to sit by yourself without distraction. Are you quickly feeling bored, restless, irritable? Is your mind kind of like saying, oh no, you've got better things to do? Well, it's just, it can be really, a really useful exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, this TRE thing, well, it ended up, let me put it this way. The first, like that next year or two, I got, and by the way, I was doing pretty hardcore yoga practice for the last, so I did Vipassana for 14 years.
Yeah.
The last 7, I took on a pretty rigorous yoga practice. I would feel my best every day for like an hour after the yoga, but it really wasn't kind of resolving like the jaw tension
Mm-hmm.
and it was like it was like a again managing the symptoms, but not getting to the root.
Mm-hmm.
So when I discovered TRE, what happened was in a year or two, I got way more out of that than the 14 years of yoga and meditation that I'd put like thousands and thousands of hours into. And,
And why is that? Can you
um,
did you figure
because,
out why was it so much more powerful in terms of
yeah,
getting so much out of it
yeah,
than the practice?
yeah. It's because what I didn't understand was the chronic tension that I was carrying, that I was aware of. I was aware of having chronic tension. What I wasn't aware of is what it represented. And what it represented was basically repressed emotion. That's what it was, right? And this TRE shaking, what it does is you're accessing this shaking mechanism, which is seeking out areas of contraction, and it starts to dissolve it. And it's a process that takes time. Okay. But as these areas of, you could call it like chronic tension or call it energetic blockages, as it gets dissolved, it's pretty interesting. It's really, really interesting to go through this process because you see how the repressed emotion, as it gets dissolved, it's you're seeing how much you can only see in retrospect how much it was affecting you. That's the thing. Like it's like that. And so for me, for example, I had social anxiety. I wouldn't have even said that about myself, but I didn't realize it until it fell away that holy smoke, I had a lot of social anxiety. So even when I was with the people that I most wanted to spend time with, hang out with my closest friends, what would happen is I would be tightening up. I would be bracing myself while we were sitting across from each other. It was like, this is like a nervous system habituated stress response, where the nervous system is responding, is saying there's a danger. And that's what's happening. So you're tightening up. It's involuntary.
Mm-hmm.
It ends up leaving you exhausted. So by the time my friend would leave, I would feel like, oh God, it feels so good. Like now I'm alone again. So I thought like I'm an introvert. I'm just one of those people that prefers to be alone with my books, right? I wasn't. I wasn't. What was happening is,
That's a story that makes a lot of sense, right?
yeah, yeah. But it turned out that that just wasn't the case. I wasn't an introvert. I wouldn't say I would say I'm probably like in the middle between, but the thing is that habituated response, which, when I've talked to hundreds of people, the vast majority of them will recognize that they have some degree of social anxiety.
Even the people who actually enjoy socializing and
Yeah.
even appear on the outside to be very open and very sort of laid back have
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Even like the people that you would least likely think that's the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, it was like I mean, this was like the like really extraordinary period of my life. And I was only 55, just, to kind of like understand,
Mm-hmm.
that to be 55 and to suddenly go through like this really big change. It was pretty dramatic. Like if I go like at 2 years where I was from where I started, wow. Even my husband, was like, I mean, he was really astounded at what he saw. And anyway, it was yeah, it was, it gave me so much insight about myself and about other people, right? A lot. And I certainly didn't have PTSD. I was probably somewhere in the middle of the population in terms of, let's say, trauma load, if you will, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and yet, like becoming aware of that, like, wow, like I was like probably like in the middle here. Wow, it gives you a new view of humanity and what people are struggling with. I'm telling you, a lot of compassion comes from that. When you see, you try to kind of like understand like, how parents are coping with jobs, a difficult economy, high grocery costs and, and raising kids with, I mean, it's just kind of insane the pressures, that
Yes.
are on families. And then when you add into it that somebody is carrying that amount of trauma and expecting them to kind of cope well, right? It really, you have to have a lot of compassion for
Yeah.
what people are up against. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. To me, this is one of the most amazing kind of byproducts of that inquiry for ourselves. That when, for me, seeing the innocence of so many coping mechanisms that have been learned, so early on. It just moves me every time I even talk about it. You know what I mean? Because I'm not saying it's an excuse for like, the hostile behavior or the violent behavior that also comes out of the same stuff. I'm not
Mm.
saying it's an excuse. I'm not saying it's a reason to put up with unacceptable behaviors, but you have such an understanding and such a compassion. I call it the compassion with capital C for like the humanity, for
Yeah.
like the human condition, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So at which point do you meet Gary?
Yeah. So that was kind of like in let me see. I think it was like in the first year of having discovered TRE.
Do you remember how you came across him?
Yeah. I saw his interview on Buddha at the gas pump.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started, I discovered that YouTube channel and I went through this period, I was like really obsessed with non-duality. Like I was just like I was just like I don't know, like the interest it was just, you know, so full on. And I watched quite a few interviews and many of them were very interesting and very inspiring. But when I saw Gary, there was a couple things about him. For one thing, he talked about this silence. Like now, he was the first of the guests that I saw that really put an emphasis on this silence. And I knew this wasn't like a manufactured silence for meditation. I knew like he was talking about the silence that I had known, right? And I also really appreciated because of my own background in science. I really appreciate that this guy, was a scientist. And I felt like, okay, he's got some objectivity here, right? I can trust him. And I just felt this, I don't know, like some sort of um, affinity for him, just that I could really trust him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I reached out to him. I sent him an email kind of telling him about my history. And I think at that point, he really wasn't working with many people, but I think he had a lot of compassion for me, when I shared him my history and everything I'd been through. And so he agreed to start
Oh,
working with me. I'll tell you, like that was a lifeline. And really, like I cannot say enough the
that's
gratitude. Like,
oh, that's so beautiful.
mm, yeah. So it really was really helped me in so many ways, to kind of like it, you know, when you're kind of like in the midway of this awakening experience, it can be so confusing, to try to kind of like make sense, what to do
What's
next.
going on? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And, we had been through so much trauma also with our son too, like that was, like another thing that was, you know, um, it was resolving, but we'd been through some tough years, and anyway, Gary was just so endlessly supportive and encouraging and compassionate and giving me really practical tools. Like he encouraged me to look into Byron Katie and Sedona method, and I really did a deep dive into both of those, and they were both pretty helpful. And to try to kind of like try different things, and um, interestingly, I didn't really do self-inquiry until I met Gary, so most people will do inquiry up until Kensho, right? And then maybe some people, I think there's people that do continue after that, in both Advaita Vedanta and like in the Zen tradition. But Gary introduced me to inquiry, and I wasn't doing inquiry kind of like in a formal seated meditation. What I was doing was, in a wordless way, I was putting my attention back onto myself as much as possible. Like, so incorporating it into the day, as I kind of like do whatever I'm doing. And I think like this really helped me in terms of, clearing out more of like the identity, clarifying things, clearing away, doubts and so on. And a lot happened between then. I worked with him for until 2019 when he stepped back from teaching. He's like, I think he's 81 now, and we're friends. I was down to visit him last year in Pennsylvania.
What is his because you mentioned, I so love when I hear about teacher, like non-dual teacher, whoever, who is open to all sorts of things. And in fact, I would say, to me, this is, me personally, this is like one of the great signs of a great teacher, one that encourage you to test and play and see what sticks with you and resonates,
Yeah.
so it works for you. You work with Gary for how long?
From I'm going to say 3.5. It was over 3 years.
That's
And
amazing.
a lot happened in that period. Actually, I think like at one point, Gary even said to me, he said, Chris, if you wanted to start working with people, he said, I would support that 100%. And I said to him, Gary, I'm not finished with my own process, and I wouldn't want to take on that role. Like I felt like I want to keep working on my own process, and um, so uh, so then what happened? Pandemic, kind of rolls in, and a friend of ours had heard about this guy in New York that was working with people on Zoom. And this is a guy who had kind of gone through a recent awakening and kind of declared himself as fully realized. And I I kind of like was accepting his, like like he spoke very confidently, and it was like the pandemic, and um, I
Oh,
started meeting with
you're talking about a non-dual teacher?
another
Right.
teacher, yeah, who
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to name, but I met with this person for about 2 years, and there was a lot of doubts that were coming up in me during this about this teacher, but and I, like the thing about it is like, in retrospect, I'm kind of surprised that, like it went on for 2 years, but it was just, um, I think that he started teaching too soon. And he was like very alone. Like he wasn't really kind of like part of like a broader community of awakening teachers where there could be some, I don't know, dialogue going on, but not a bad person. And I wouldn't say it was a complete waste of time, but I would say that what did happen is it added to some confusion for me about myself in the awakening process that kind of, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Um anyway,
That is so interesting, given everything you've been through up until that
yeah.
point. Wow.
Anyway, what happened was kind of like coming up to the 2 year mark with this, what happened was I started to feel like, okay, I can't continue working with this person. And it just really kind of hit me that I'm going to just have to take full responsibility for myself. There's no other help to be had. All right. And it just, I I felt like, okay, I'm just going to kind of like, kind of like clear the table of everything I think I know about what awakening is, all the ideas, all the notions, everything I have learned about it or assumed to be true about it. I'm going to let it all go.
Was it difficult to do for you?
No, no, there was a feeling of desperation. It's like a feeling of, it felt like I have no choice. I felt like the longing I felt like this, let me put it this way. I felt like I had a responsibility to the process itself. I already got to the point where it was like clear to me that the process was beyond my control. The process was happening. And that I would say I was really clear, like I was being subjected to a process. All right. I knew it, but I felt like the sense of helplessness about what to do. How do I work with this process? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done a lot of self-inquiry. I felt like I had taken inquiry as far as I possibly could. So then I just kind of, it was like a rebellion came up in me. It's like a very kind of like almost like a teenage rebellion, like, kind of feeling came up. And this felt like, damn it, I'm going to figure this out, if it costs me my life, I'm going to figure this out. And it was almost like, if you can think of it kind of like this, like I had this idea like, well, okay, well, what if I were shipwrecked and I were on a desert island and there was no books, no teacher, no YouTube, no resources, and I had to figure this
Mm-hmm.
thing out? What would,
Mm-hmm.
so it was almost like that kind of an attitude. And I remember just kind of like, I would sit every day, not meditating, but just give myself, sometimes I would sit like for 2 or 3 hours and I would just sit with this kind of a determination, right? And I just found myself kind of feeling like, okay, it was almost like I was kind of approaching it from some sort of logical perspective of it has to be here somehow, right? It has to be here. It can't be in a book. It can't be in a teaching. It has to be here, right? Like, nobody ever told me that, but I was kind of felt like, this is where I have to look. And what happened is it started to kind of dawn on me about the senses, the sense gates. Like I started to have this, um, it just became the most obvious thing to me. It's about the senses, right? It's like, how could it be anything else, right? Like, if we think about it like this, right? We're in this human form, right? And all the information, everything that we know is coming in through these sense gates, all of it. So we construct this idea of ourself and the world, but it's information coming in through the sense gates that gets processed and interpreted by the mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I had like this big insight that realized like, holy smoke, like the interface upon which all of this has been gathered, I've not looked at. How could that happen? And it was just kind of like the profundity of it. And so I really put my attention on the sense gate. So I started to kind of like really put my attention on seeing and hearing and body sense. And then I had this insight that I couldn't separate this thing called awareness from any of them. I knew there was something about that, but I didn't know what. But I knew it's like, wow, this is interesting. Like I thought awareness was a separate thing, right? But I can't separate, I can't tease it apart from seeing, hearing, body sense. Like it's not possible. And I knew there was something about that. And it was kind of like the vividness of the senses started to kind of really like it was like they had like like a vividness of the senses coming alive, intimacy, of what was coming in through the senses. There was something that was coming into my awareness about like the significance of the sense gates and that this thing called awareness. I was seeing something about awareness in a different way, like that's a whole topic in itself, but
That is it. And I was just going to say, like, that alone is massive to
yeah,
see awareness as something that's not separate.
yeah,
As you said earlier. Yeah.
yeah. Um, And I would say, like, I mean, another thing that kind of, because of like let's say the desperation of the state that I was in, another thing I would say is that I would say, there was a little bit of reactivity left, but it was very low level. But somehow, in really kind of like focusing my attention, back on myself and try to see, okay, what can I what can I see that's going on? I'm trying to kind of like look as like maybe from like scientifically, objectively as I can to, try to help myself. And I realized that there had been a narrative of I don't have any reactivity anymore. Isn't that wonderful? That had been going on for a few years. And I probably was mostly true. Like, but I would say that I was pretty much done with like a reactivity and emotion work in general. Like, and I was like pretty happy about that.
Yeah.
But what I overlooked is like there was still a little bit of reactivity. It was still a little bit. And somehow like it kind of now I felt like, oh, I gotta put some attention on this. It just intuited that there was something there, right? That thing that feels like it wants to rise up to defend or protest or reject, even if it's not visible to anybody else. The fact that it was there at all, even like on a subtle level. And I was like, because I had maybe like a level of inner quietude that had come from the years of TRE, I had a lot of, let's say, bandwidth in which to kind of like look at myself that I would not have had otherwise. And then I could see, oh yeah, there is this. It's funny how the mind can fool you, it can take on a narrative, and delude you. I've seen it
Big time. Big time. Is the greatest, the most intelligent trickster
Yeah.
of all time. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, let's put it this way. Maybe I had like 15% reactivity left. And now that I've turned my attention on it, I could actually see it in real time and I could actually work with it until it dissolved. And that's a really interesting thing to go through too, where you see the whole thing, the whole apparatus, if you will. You see well, interesting, like the absence of the apparatus is what leads it to kind of fall. But it's an interesting thing in, humanity, this thing called reactivity. And so that really helped as well. And then it kind of like on the heels of that, like I just felt like, wow, there was like a confidence that was coming because I felt like, yeah, I'm seeing things that, and I'm making some progress, like it was undeniable. And so there was like a feeling of confidence and like hope about this. And I just felt like I'm in this to the end. Like I'm not stopping. And I felt like I had come so far in my life out of, kind of suffering that I felt like, you know what, like I am not going to waste this.
Yeah.
That would be like ridiculous to kind of, feel like, well, this is good enough. I could have easily said that, like life was so much better than I'd ever hoped for, but something in me knew that there was something incomplete and I felt like it would be stupid for me to just kind of,
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, interesting how there's a beautiful thing about awakening. And Gary had pointed this out to me. He said, Chris, he says, you're going to see something. He says, as you go deeper into the awakening process, what you're going to see is the things that are going to be needed to help you are going to come to you. They're going to come to you,
Big
right?
time. Yeah.
And and he said in a way it's confirming that the awakening it's anyway it's one of the most beautiful things about it. Anyway, okay, so roughly like this whole period where things kind of like really kind of came to a head and I just was doing all of this like looking, right, and insights were coming. A very dear friend learned about Angelo, got his book, read it, and then decided to get a copy for me. She's never done anything like this, but she got a copy for me, came over to my house and said, Chris, she said, I think you're going to like this. Let's call this an early birthday gift. So this is like, a few months before my birthday, but she just had this intuition, right? And
That's amazing.
I read the book and it was just like, oh my, I was like, I couldn't believe it. The timing of it couldn't have been better. And I reached out to Angelo and just kind of gave him a summary of everything that happened. And he was just so kind and so gracious, to say, you know what, like, what, I'll work with you, just through messaging. And things went really, really fast. Yeah, I think it was like less than 3 months. And so it felt like just so much happened, and yeah, just absolutely, there's no words for it. There's no words to describe, coming into contact with Angelo, and he's so unique, and he is, I think, from my perspective, what I can see, he's helping more people out there who've, let's say, post-awakening, get into deeper stages of awakening. I don't know of anybody who's doing it as with the success that he's doing it. There's a clarity about his teaching and his understanding of this process that is just absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can't say that I know him super well, like, beyond our because we interacted quite a bit, for a while, because I ended up, I invited him on my channel, then I ended up on his channel, then we met a couple of times, as in like on Zoom. But yeah, when I read his book, I thought, wow, I've never met I've never read a book where someone lays out the process in a way that was not just clear,
Mm-hmm.
incredibly helpful for people who are in that process to
Mm.
even like I could imagine, in a period after my first awakening where I had zero reference point, I had no idea what was going on with me
Mm.
or what I should do. Had I read that book, I would be able to find myself and quite literally locate as to where I was in the journey. He's one of those people that I've heard from other people where, even through conversations and hearing other people's stories on his channel, that when someone, you don't know what you have not gone through.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And he's gone through this stuff. So when he hears this, it's like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about. Where so many people have various experiences, go to teach, and I know that from those people as I'm seeing them, that they have various experiences. They can't find the frame of reference for what that, I have no understanding. They go from one teacher to another, and not only that they don't find any confirmation or understanding, their experiences are often invalidated
Mm-hmm.
because they, in particular, when they don't fit the
Mm.
particular tradition's framework or the particular belief system of the teacher or whatever, yeah. And
Mm.
so then you come across someone like Angelo, you tell him what's been going on, he's like, that's what's going on.
Yeah.
That's where
Yeah.
you're at. This is
Yeah.
where you need to go now. Like, I mean, he's such a gift, this guy.
Yeah.
In terms of like the modern, I love the versatility in particular, and the fact that he relates to so many that it really doesn't matter if you don't have to be spiritual. It doesn't matter what background you're coming from. You'll find something for you in whatever he's talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I think that he's really outstanding too, from what I can see, is it's pretty amazing how he really helps to people to look at thought. Like, don't avoid it, don't try to manage it, but turn and investigate it. Like, see what it is in your own experience, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
don't understand it, right, it becomes like this enemy, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So much of, like, let's say, Buddhism is about trying to get a quiet mind through meditation,
Yes.
but it's not
Yeah.
about really understanding what the heck is thought. Right? And we have like this ignorance because we don't really take a look and see thought objectively for what
Mm-hmm.
it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then beliefs, that's a whole other topic as well, right?
Yeah.
That um, you know, he's very, very good at helping to, get people to, see, what do you believe about yourself? What are you taking to be true and not questioning here, right? And how is that defining your experience?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
just gets more and more subtle as you go on,
It
right?
does get, yeah. And this is what, once again, that he is so brilliant because it does get more and more subtle and more nuance. So you must have had those experiences in order to be able to see that nuance.
Yeah.
So where do we want to go from here? So so shall we talk about liberation?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting topic in itself. Um, let me start by saying that
Yeah.
I had a lot of fantasies about what that would be.
Mm-hmm.
I think which a lot of people do, we have these fantasies about liberation, right? And um, the thing about it is, even when you get into the deeper stages of realization, like non-dual realization, what comes to be seen is that we often kind of come to this by way of some, um, what feels like religious or ritual, based practices. So like, let's say if it's like Tibetan Buddhism or Zen or Advaita Vedanta, there can have this feeling of like the mystical, the religious, it's imbued with a lot of like culture and um, ideas about the holy and, and specialness and so on. And in a way that's, it, what can I say about it? I think like it serves a function in terms of it's kind of like drawing people,
Mm-hmm.
that's the positive way we can look at it. But at a certain point, we have to let go of these ideas because they become an obstruction. And just moving into deeper stages of awakening, like full on non-dual realization, it doesn't feel it doesn't feel let's say religious or mystical or anything like you thought it would be. In fact, like I mean, it's really quite like the thing about it is it's so natural. And I think that for a lot of us, there's like a recognition here that it feels so familiar. I think it feels so familiar because we all experienced it when we're very small. But it's not like religious. It's so
Yeah.
it can be surprising in like it's so obvious that, well, oh, okay, it has this obvious like how it couldn't be any other way than it is. That's one of the things that comes with non-dual realization is they cannot be any other way than this, right? And so that there's that aspect and non-dual realization, I mean, there's a lot we could say about it. But it also helps to help with deconstructing again, like more of identity, as
Mm-hmm.
you see clearly, like, things like this, like it's just um, you realize um, it's also really impacting your understanding of yourself. Whatever remains intact at this point is now being laid bare, right? That the narrative, the memories. I remember saying to my husband one day, I said, I said, I realize that, I have a wonderful husband. I'm very, very blessed. He's very dear to me. And I said to him one day, I said, I'm realizing now, my idea about you, it's a lot of it is just like a pure mental construct that's been stitched together from all the memories that we've shared, and the interpretation I have of you, right? And
Yeah.
I said, like, you're unknowable. And he's got a great sense of humor. And he laughed and he said, you know what, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like it's
Oh
just
my God, that is amazing. I love that.
um Yeah, there's something really beautiful, I have to say. I've been really, really blessed in the sense that, my husband and I went through like, we a lot of the typical things that people can struggle with in marriage. But, I mean, there's been a really beautiful friendship, all throughout. And I think, uh, you know, anyway, one thing I will say about it is that it's really obvious to both of us how in this relationship, the awakening process is actually um, it's like we see like in the dynamic of the relationship how we've been helping each other with the process.
Yeah.
It's really, really wonderful. And we're both grateful for that. Uh,
Yeah.
mm,
I there's something in terms of liberation, like just as you were speaking, the impact on a relationship alone, like, and I'm talking a really good, because I've been so blessed that I've been in a relationship now for 12 years with really my best friend as well, you know, so and we've been through a lot, you know, like, I mean, I went through this whole period after the first awakening, like I said, where I was falling apart, Chris. I was falling apart, and it really moves me. Actually, I can't believe that we're even talking about it. He
Mm.
was that space for me to fall apart.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
almost like his love was like the metaphor for what we're talking about. You know, it's the space in which you can, collapse
Mm.
and get up again and fall apart, and there's a space for that to be there without anyone judging you for it, or where you don't have to fear that they will leave you if you like don't wash your hair for 5 weeks or something like that, or
Mm.
I'm kidding, like I'm making up these, you know what I'm talking about, yeah. and
Yeah.
and it's been amazing actually that we've been happy together, and there's like this level of freedom of that friendship in that relationship that's already been there. But after liberation, like at least for me, it was like there's just, I didn't even know there could be more freedom in like for our individual human expressions, for all our moods, for the little irritations, for the little, there's even more. Like there's, to me again, it's such a metaphor of this like complete openness
Yeah.
to the humanness, which is not only not tried to be fixed or gotten rid of or whatever. It's just, you can't even talk about the human as being fully embraced, because it's just what's going on. It's just one massive changeable happening that is just incredible, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. It is very beautiful. It really is. And like you said, like the human aspect of it, like it is the thing that it kind of amazes me, like this aspect of it. There's so many paradoxes with awakening, as I'm sure you know, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to be capable of accepting paradoxical or we're not going to get very far with this. But like the thing that, really kind of like became so obvious to me is that there's something about this that, it's kind of like the realization takes us to see the truth that we're not what we thought. So yes, there's a human life, there's a human experience, but what we are is not that, right? It's arising within that. But if we deny like aspects of this human experience, if we bypass it, if we try to hide from it,
Mm.
within or without, if we don't, like, if we're trying to kind of like hide from ourselves certain uncomfortable truths, or even like things about the world, right? If we're hiding from any of it, right, we're going to get stalled. Like we have to kind of like fully it's kind of like the more that we can kind of like understand what it is to be human, it
Mm.
helps us with the realization process, something like that. There's like
Mm.
those two go together, you know.
Yeah, I mean, when it's good that I just remember when we talked about Angelo, that actually when I ended up on his channel and I was sharing the story, he figured out the impact and the magnitude of what happened before I did.
Ah.
So it was it was not so much as it was fresh, but it was actually the first time that I tried to talk about it.
Hmm.
But it took, I'm still seeing the implications of that. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? In a sense. And one of the things that I love so much also about him, and it's kind of related to what we are saying, is that wherever there's like fixating or like fixations or aversions toward anything, and I see this even in people who had like really massive realizations, where there's such a, but not this, but not that, let's not talk about that, we're not going that, and I'm thinking, how's that even with that level of realization even possible? Because you know, I now even get to the point where, you know, there was a point where I even felt like I had to say a parent, not because someone told me to, but because I didn't want, like, I needed to make sure that everybody knows that, like, it just appears that way, or like whatever. Or even I couldn't actually genuinely say things like in my experience. I couldn't say in my experience. I would say here.
Okay.
Because it was just, I couldn't, you know,
Yeah.
I just really genuinely could. I found it so uncomfortable to talk about me when I couldn't find any me anymore. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? It was just so bizarre.
Yeah.
So even that's been a process of coming to such an ordinariness of just talking exactly the way I used to talk my entire life. You know what I mean? So there's a process of like settling of things and normalizing, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It gets weird out there in YouTube land, the ways people start to talk and it gets copied
Which you blend,
and
yes.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, one of the best things that I shared this with Angelo a few weeks ago. I said, Angelo, like I just want to share with you one of the things that you said to me
Hmm.
early on that I'm so grateful for was he said, Chris, he says, you're going to have to, maintain some level of vigilance for the rest of your life because the tendency to form a view, it's not going to go away. With liberation, it's still that tendency for, something to kind of like coalesce into a view, a position, you know, it's still going to happen. And I'm so grateful that he pointed that out because I'll tell you, like it's saving me some trouble because I can see it, and it still happens. Like I see it on a daily basis where, you know, uh something might happen that it's not that like there's like a level of reactivity, anything remotely like it would have been, but it's kind of like where I see like that the the something is kind of like trying to kind of like come into a viewpoint to take a position. And he said what that is he says you can say it's kind of like the most basic way that identity tries to kind of like form itself. So man, I can see it, in other people out there with YouTube channels, that I can see that tendency, right?
Yeah.
They start like, criticizing each other and all kinds of nonsense going on out there.
Yeah.
Um,
This has been the biggest shock for me, I have to say, because as you know, I started learning about the process after I've been through the process, which, was like I entered a whole new world of education.
uh,
And this is where I ate the humble pie because that's when when I went through the process of like the shadow work, I didn't know I was doing shadow work. I only found out later on that this is what it's called, shadow work. When I got to the core wound of the little girl that was like feeding herself with
mm,
food, to cope, to keep
mm,
herself feel safe,
mm,
right? And then so many beliefs coming out of that, and so much pain and self-hatred that I was in it, eh, that I had, nobody asked me to do that. So, nobody said, oh, this is the work you need to do. This is step by step, it's just what amazes me, Chris, about this journey is here I was without that point of reference or knowledge about what needs to be done.
mm.
Life itself, the intelligence of this unfolding
Yeah,
astounds me. It blows my mind every time when I see it in other people,
yeah,
right? Even the intelligence of you one day going, fuck this, I'm not gonna listen to this teacher anymore. I'm gonna imagine that I'm on that island and I'm not going to, no books, no resources. I'm just gonna go through this on my own. Like even that, how and look how many insights you had just through that process alone, right? One of the things that I wanted what I loved that you said on your in your bio at the end was you know, because liberation is often seen as like, okay, so this is the end point. So like this is the arrival point, right? And, you know, and I mean, it makes me laugh for many reasons because just, you know, from like if we really got into like the whole conversation about the time even and like, you know,
Yeah.
the point in time being the start and arrival point, all of that, right? But can we talk a little bit about
It's not really an endpoint. Like it's like what I would say is that the way let me put it like this. If we can put it like this, there's two big points in the way this typically unfolds for people, where you have that first big shift, right? And that's for most people is kind of like the biggest thing that's ever happened to them, up to that point in their life. And then there's like a lot of stuff that happens, like the motion work, shadow work, and there's a
Mhm.
lot that happens, with beliefs and thoughts. It's a really quite an incredible process that happens. And I think the way I think of it is like it's like a very deep emotional and psychological and physical and energetic healing, if you will. It's kind of like everything that needs to be cleared out has to be cleared out. Otherwise, things are in a stall, right? So it's a very healing process, but in its nature.
Mhm.
And then, uh, at a certain point, like, we have like the non-dual realization, that which is very, very beautiful, very, it has a richness about it, uh, a sweetness about it, Um, and then this thing called anatta, I think there's like a lot of confusion and a lot of fantasy about it, that people have, but it's probably in my experience anyway, it was nothing like I imagined it would be. Nothing. In fact, it was very shocking when it got underway. It was just not I there's no way you can really prepare somebody for this, honestly. So it's kind of like the way to think of it is kind of like that feeling of me, that personal me, right? That's just assumed to be here, right? Everything is happening to me, right? And
Mhm.
it's kind of like it's almost like a thought, but a thought that has a certain significance to it. Something happens to that where you could say it just kind of disappears or
Mhm.
collapses or whatever, right?
Mhm.
But when it's gone, boy, it's really incredible how much that can change your experience. Um, and it can feel like there's something missing. um, and it can feel I don't know, there can be for me there was like a kind of a grief that came up um, for a while, like for maybe the whole summer, a kind of a grief, and it was a weird kind of a grief that it was kind of like a grieving for a life that had never existed. And it was so weird, it was kind of like almost like, okay, I just realized like I've been in a movie, but it's just a movie and I thought it was real, and now I'm realizing it was just a movie, something like that.
Mhm.
And I cannot tell you the amount of grief that, you know, but it was weird because even the grief, like one of the things that was kind of crazy about that, it's kind of felt like the one who would feel the grief can't be found. That was the weird.
Right. That's weird, right? So there's just grief.
There's
Yeah,
just grief.
exactly.
There's just
Yeah. Yeah,
grief.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and
yeah.
and that was like one of the things that was, I would say, like the real mind fuck was just like, I can't find the one that, is
Yeah.
having grief. And um and I kind of felt, man, if I could just take one step back, that was so great for us. And I wanted to kind of like, because I've got like this amazing circle of friends that are all like very passionate, and like we're really, full on, in terms of commitment to this whole process. And I felt like saying, guys, just take a break. Like, don't like, just, like, you know, I felt like I wanted to warn them. I mean, I didn't, but I felt like I want to warn them. Just, like slow down.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's the truth.
Enjoy being human. Like in that, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I think people can have a lot of like variety of experiences here.
Hmm.
Not everybody's going to like, so if somebody hears that from me, don't think that's necessarily going to be your experience at all. It might be something
Yes.
completely
Yes.
different. You
Yes.
might
Yes.
laugh. You might think this is like the greatest thing ever, you know,
Yeah.
saying
It's
that
so
that's,
true. Yeah.
yeah. Um, but for me, it was, it was kind of like strange because like on the one sense, I could say that there was like a kind of almost like a honeymoon phase to it as well. Like, in another way, like I felt kind of like really, it's impossible to talk about how
Yeah.
like the,
Yeah.
the combination of things, like a feeling of well-being, but feeling of grief and kind of an existential loneliness was there as well. And, the visual field, like it was somewhat changed in the sense that it's almost like when I looked at things, like it was almost like I could see like a decay in them, even something that it wouldn't like, I don't know, it's hard to talk about, but it's gone now, thank
Mm-hmm.
God, because it was
Mm-hmm.
kind of disturbing at the time. And there's, what, this is like a really, I think in the next few years, it's going to be interesting. I think there's going to be a lot more people showing up that are going through this process. I think it's happening now. I think we're going to see
Big time. Yeah.
lot, a lot of people going through this, and I think we're going to need a lot more resources to support people going through this process. And I think we're going to learn a lot too, because it's still, this whole thing has been shrouded in such secrecy.
Yes.
You didn't talk about it to anybody but maybe your Zen teacher,
Yeah.
and nobody talked among themselves. There's no sharing. And so I
Ha-
think,
Have you
yeah.
ever read Bernadette Roberts' books? I mean, I don't know. I just love her so much. I have such a something with her that um I don't know. I in some very strange way I feel so completely like connected to her. And I read her books multiple times. And one of my favorite bits in the book is actually when at the end of everything she's been through, and boy, she's had some intense
Yeah.
experiences. She was talking to her neighbor who she became friends with. It was this elderly woman that was quite older than she was at the time. And they were just it's like they were on a journey together, but in two very different ways, two completely unique ways. And then they come together and talk about it for days and days and days. And they realize that even though their journeys were unfolding in unique, different ways to them, they were actually talking about the same thing. And Bernadette said, this is when I learned few things, that it wasn't actually as special as I thought it was. It actually wasn't even as rare as I thought it was.
Of Anata. And I have a bit of mixed feelings about that. I don't know if we can be so certain about that. There's some scholars that would take issue with it framing that way, that Advaita Vedanta stops at kind of like that sense of I am, clarifying that,
Yeah.
because even Nisargadatta, he said to stay in the I am, to go beyond the I am. I'm convinced that Nisargadatta attained,
Yeah.
separation. I'm also
Yeah.
convinced that Ramana Maharshi did too.
Yeah.
Um, the main thing that we have that people reference with Ramana's teachings is the book Talks with Ramana. But
Mhm.
there's other interesting works that David Godman compiled, and David Godman has spoken directly about this issue, and he says that it's the same thing, in that Ramana also uh, you know basically Ramana's teachings will take you to full liberation as well. I look at Ramana's teachings now, like what I see of it, what I know of it.
Mhm.
And like I can see how it's like kind of like amazing. They were wonderful in their time. But I think that it probably was the case that it helped a lot of people with, let's call it Kensho or First Awakening.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, he really didn't talk about emotion work or shadow work. It was all about, let's say, the technique of staying with the
Yeah.
inquiry, right? Is like
Yeah.
that would resolve everything. Well, I would say it was the case for Nisargadatta, like it actually did work for him. But I think realistically for most people, it's going to be more like Angelo's approach where you're recognizing there is a need to do this emotion work, that shadow work, looking at beliefs, actually making a study of your own thoughts is going to
Mm-hmm.
become critical at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Because doubt tends to be a persisting troublemaker for people. And if they
Mm-hmm.
don't understand what thought is, they're going to have a very difficult time with doubt.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to like the differences between the, at all, and I'm kind of glad because boy, am I glad that I never was sucked into the debates about who's right, who's wrong, what liberation mean. Yeah, so this is why I so love to talk about, what that is in your experience or what that is in my experience or what is, yeah, rather than turning it into this is what it is and this is how it works or this is how it shows up for everybody, which is another thing that I noticed happening a lot where um there is sharing of an experience and rather than presenting it in my experience this is what it feels like or in my experience this is how that looks like, it's turned into this is how it is, like as the rule that applies to everybody else, right? And one of the things that have been so illuminating about learning about this process is see how incredibly unique this is for everybody, how incredibly intimate. And it actually gets to the point where two people or three people can speak and it will appear as though they're talking about the same thing.
Mm.
But actually, when you start getting into nuance, we're talking about different things. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
these, right? So I mean,
yeah, yeah.
and I think that there's something amazing about it because to me, this is life, this greatest teacher of all, constantly saying, don't hold on to this description.
Mm,
Don't hold on to this idea. Don't think that just because it happened this way to multiple people,
mm,
that it has to happen to you the same way,
mm,
right? Or like, that sort of thing. So
mm.
it's not just illuminated, but it's sort of humbling. It's continuously humbling. But as I was saying, like with Bernadette, what I loved so much that she completed it with that kind of conclusion, because I noticed that there's like you said, there's so much almost like a sense of specialness and superiority of some
Mm,
spiritual
yeah,
superiority
yeah.
around even that word enlightenment, which by the way I think it's a beautiful word in and of itself, but there's almost like this, like you said, I think you mentioned like the sort of like this exalted almost religious like kind of a state that's
Mhm.
not for like mere mortals. It's not like from my neighbor next door or for
Yeah.
some, yeah. And I know for the fact that many people who were otherwise open to exploring spirituality and enlightenment were put off by
Mm,
it because they assumed this is
mm.
for special kind of people. Like this is for like,
Oh,
you know what I
so
mean?
true. Absolutely, absolutely. I agree with you, 100% on that.
Yeah.
That a lot of people, maybe struggle already with like a sense of insecurity or unworthiness, right? And then feel like this something that comes up. I don't deserve this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Mm-hmm.
deserve to be liberated,
Mm-hmm.
Like so. Yeah, it's the thing about it is where it takes you is it's kind of like seeing that there's something just so not special about it. Um and yet it is special at the same time. That's
Yes,
the point,
yes,
right? Like
yes.
and I don't think I don't know, like, I don't think if you did a survey of people and said, would you
Yeah.
go back? I was really surprised me if people would say yes. I think I was better off before. That would kind of surprise me.
Yeah.
But like it is, it is a quite a remarkably different way of living, because, it's, to live from a place that's non-conceptual, right? And to really live from a place that's non-conceptual, like that is just something that is radically different than,
Yeah.
the way that most people are oriented. And there's something so obvious about it, right? There's an obviousness about that, let's say the seeing, kind of like if we let go of all the words about it, even trying to define what this is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Enlightenment or realization, or whatever. We drop all the words, right? And we just kind of
Mm-hmm.
go right to the direct experience, without labels, without words, without conception. There's like an obviousness about it that it can't be anything other than this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's um, uh, something that, it's like as Angela would say, it's like a very unfiltered way of living, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, what I mean by that, in a way, you can feel more vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't really hide, from anything in yourself, in what's going on. And in my experience, like, I feel like things are happening. Like it feels like it's still dynamic. It has this dynamic thing about it. Mm.
Yeah. But when we talked about the end point, right? There not being an end point, because some people ask, is there a point, does any emotional work end after liberation? Does any trauma work end after liberation? Can you speak to that? Because you're the only person that I know that actually works with trauma specifically and also experienced liberation, that maybe could answer
Yeah,
this question.
yeah, that's a really good question. What I can say about it is, um, I personally have a very high sense of well-being, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the truth. That's the real truth. So, uh, but I have had a couple of childhood traumas kind of like process out in the last year that kind of surprised me, because I kind of felt like, well, I don't think anything is going to really happen in that way now. And it wasn't anything that I didn't know about, or anything like, if I told you what it was, it wouldn't be like, oh, that's such a big deal. But there was kind of a recognition when the emotion came up, when the memory about it came up, I realized, oh, actually, well, at the time it was a big deal. It was a big deal, and it did represent something that was kind of like overwhelmingly stressful for me at that age. And I just didn't realize, like, it was still somewhere, right? And then it just kind of came up, the memory around it and the emotion attached to it. And this is like after quite a long pause of not having
Mm-hmm.
it kind of like, kind of like come up to my awareness like that.
Mm-hmm.
And like, in terms of emotions, like, I don't like, my emotions seem to be quite changed now. I don't know if it's like this for you, but the way I experience emotion seems to have shifted quite a lot. And so I used to be somebody that could have like a lot of volatility, and I think at one point my family probably thought I was going crazy. And I mean, that was like post-awakening, many years
Yeah,
post-awakening.
yeah, yeah.
But but um but things kind of like, um as reactivity, as repressed emotion got processed out, as I worked on reactivity, like, it was like the waters calmed a lot. and it's gotten to the point where it just kind of like surprises me. It's at times I'll find myself in a situation and it's like, this is weird. I'm not getting the emotion that I thought I would be getting. Like I'll share with you, for example, my wonderful husband had a stroke about 15 months ago, and we didn't know what was going on, but like, I came home and I could tell there was something not right, and called an ambulance. Anyway, it's a bit of a story to tell you the whole thing, but it was the case before that I used to be very aware of like this incredible level of attachment to him, right? And it was like clearly to me, like of all, if I, it was like I didn't have to think about it, what the biggest attachment was, it was him. And so here I was in a situation where, I knew something serious was going wrong, and I was in a position of having to kind of like advocate on his behalf and even change hospitals I had to basically change him to hospitals to get care that he needed. Anyway, it was a major stroke. It had really big consequences for his life. He's a brilliant mind, in the field of science that he was working, and he hasn't been able to work since. Didn't lose any motor function, but he has something called aphasia, expressive aphasia, so he can communicate, but he often has confusion around, he'll be thinking one word and another word will come out. It's called,
Gosh, Chris, that was only 15 months
yeah,
ago.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and you know what? The interesting thing about it is like as it was happening, I also was aware that, wow, I know that if this had happened like a year or two before, I knew I would have been so overwhelmed with fear that I couldn't think clearly. And I had to take some steps like that ended up being really important. I had to change him from a small community hospital where they didn't know what was going on after 24 hours and get him to a major hospital where they suddenly, moved very quickly and you know, he got the treatment that he needed. Um, but I wouldn't have had the clarity and I wouldn't have had the capacity to advocate for him to do what needed to be done because I would have been so, inhibited about kind of like questioning medical professionals who I felt like know more than me. So how can I question them, right? But I also knew that fear would have been like kind of paralyzing, right? And I was like, where's the fear? Where's the fear? There's no fear and there's nothing to feel like the feeling like as I was going through this whole thing, which, ended up kind of like 9 days of him being in the hospital, was like kind of astonishment at kind of like there was like there was nothing that could argue with what was happening,
Yes. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and a crazy level of trust that everything was going to be okay no matter what. No matter what, it was going to be okay. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I love that because it's amazing how I honestly come to like this conclusion that we're literally wired as human sort of species,
Mhm.
the brain and everything, to deal with reality. Like honestly, like if we're
Yes.
just in reality of what is, as opposed to here in the narratives about the reality and manage trying to control and manage and
Yeah.
all this movement in that we literally have everything, the capacity, the resilience, the everything to deal with what's right in front of us, no
Yeah.
matter how crisis,
Yeah.
whether it's a crisis, and I've seen it. I've seen this, multiple times, um, what happens. Um, the other thing I wanted to ask you is because I truly believe that there's not one modality. Call me out if I'm wrong, okay? But I truly believe that there's no such thing as bad or good modality. There are simply different modalities, and every modality can either serve you well or it can trap you or like do the opposite, Um, and then there's other factors that come into as to why, or maybe the timing where you're at, also the person that actually is even doing the modality might not be right for you, right?
Yeah.
And so on.
Mm.
How can the trauma work become a trap?
Man, I'm glad you brought this up because I think we have the potential, the amazing, potential to fixate on anything. And that is, it's really remarkable, right?
Yes.
And like, I think like the whole thing about trauma, we're in a very much a trauma informed culture now, which has been good in the sense that there's been like a big correction for something that was a problem, right? But what I will say about it is it's a bit unfortunate. Like, for example, I've had people come to me and say, I need your help. I have complex PTSD. And I'm not a trained mental health professional.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's not clear. I have like my certification in TRE, that's it. But I have enough, understanding here to be able to say, look, this person self-diagnosed. Okay, no mental health professional told them that. They read a book, and then they look at their self and now they've got this self-diagnosis. I have complex PTSD. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this a few times. And this is a real problem where somebody now takes on a belief about their situation and they're not understanding. I have met people with an actual diagnosis with complex PTSD, and I'm telling you, these people are, that is a real diagnosis. Okay, make no mistake about it. It's a very, very serious diagnosis. But it's unfortunate, like how much like the dialogue around this has now made everybody think they've got PTSD, or way too many people think that about themselves, when the problem is maybe more about they should look more in beliefs, right? Look there. Yeah, you probably have some trauma, I'll admit that, but it's not what you're making it out to be. You need to look more into the beliefs and the narrative. So yeah, there's definitely a problem in this, that people overly fixate on it, and they don't let, I think that people would do well to kind of like try to take a balanced perspective in looking at
Mm-hmm.
themselves. One thing I will say about it that is kind of like a unfortunate consequence of what's happened in terms of like let's say the public dialogue on it, is now we have a whole industry around trauma. And I meet people, I've met a number of people who have spent insane amount of money, like there's some people who have like very good marketing skills who are putting themselves out there with courses to help you with your trauma. And these people, they really don't have like the qualifications, in my opinion, but they've got very good marketing skills.
Yeah.
And so because it's like such a hot topic, right?
Yeah.
That I think that this is a really unfortunate thing that's happened. I really appreciate like what David Bersolli has done here with TRE, in terms of he never set out to make money from it. It was really about showing somebody like this is something that you were born with, right? And it is an amazing healer within. I'm going to show you this, and then I want you to use it however you see fit. I want you to be the one. You're going to be your own therapist with this, right?
Yeah.
So, and I mean, there are some other good therapies out there. I've heard very good things about EMDR, which, I think
Mm-hmm.
you should probably work with a therapist for the most part.
Yeah.
I think breathwork can be interesting for some
Oh,
people.
breathwork is amazing. I've done breathwork simply because I met someone who does breathwork. So I was like, I'm gonna give it a go,
Yeah,
just to see. And it was amazing, what was released at that point.
yeah,
That I didn't even know at this point, I didn't even know what it was or like where it came from, like whatever. But I didn't need to know. It's like whatever wanted to be released was released. There's the beneficial side of talk. People finally are not ashamed to talk about trauma. They're not, it's like people are way more relaxed to talk about it. There's nothing wrong with you because you've been, all that stigma around those things. So that's definitely a good thing. The other side of it is like making anything that's, slightly disturbing to like this traumatic thing when it really isn't, right?
yeah.
But I'm also interested in what you think because I know for the fact, because I met people who said that they got to the point where in the process of awakening, they were told that unless they work through all the trauma, they will not awake. Like they cannot, you know what I mean? Or they cannot get to the end of this process unless they work through, yeah? So now they had this literally extra pressure on themselves trying to dig, you know, for
Oh, yeah, yeah,
whatever trauma is left there.
yeah,
And really,
yeah,
and to me, that was a trap, you
yeah.
know, because it was now being forced instead of just unfolding naturally, so to speak, with a bit of help. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, they're very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous. I don't think that we need to like go digging per se. Like the thing is
Mm-hmm.
that the awakening process, it is in by its nature, it is a natural process. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I have to also kind of like consider the fact that awakening for us, you and me, and many people that we know, it's happening in a Western, cultural
Mm-hmm.
context,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where repressed emotion is the norm. And so we have to take that into consideration, right? That is the reality. So what I mean by that is that if we were a part of a culture that didn't have a lot of heavy emotional repression, well, awakening would probably progress in a different way. That's all I'm saying. So we have to take that into consideration that that's the reality. Okay. But I think that if we think of it kind of like we're looking at a balanced way at ourselves, right? And a good place for us to look, like back to what I said before, if you just kind of give yourself some time to just sit quietly, right? How easy for you is it for you to just sit alone by yourself without distraction? How effortless is that? How enjoyable is it, right? If there's some difficulty, there's a lot of avoidance about it, right? Um, the desire to distract yourself, or like, oh, I don't have time for this or whatever, right? Or there's some discomfort here, then that's a clue that you need to do some looking here. And I would say like try, start with, like breath work or TRE, it's not going to cost you a lot of money. It is a little bit treacherous to recommend a therapist for somebody because a lot of things can go wrong here. There are some very good therapists out there, but I think a lot of them really don't know. Like there's a lot of times what's happening is management of emotions rather than really feeling
Yeah.
emotion.
Yeah.
Um, or putting, like, coming to a better story about your issues
Yes,
or
yes, yes, yeah.
so,
Reframing and
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So if we kind of like really take stock, well, how do I feel? Am I struggling with anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
social anxiety, shame, to learn the basic skills of being with your emotions. And this is a skill that most people are going to have to learn. Really, it's Angela's channel's got a really good playlist on basics of emotion work. I think a lot of people can do this on their own.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be easy. It's going to take some time and some like a good attitude about it and recognition that it is important. It can't be skipped over.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a kind of like a key thing here that we have to take responsibility for ourselves. Okay,
Yeah.
nobody can do the emotion work for us. And
Yeah.
just going to sit with a therapist is not going to be enough. It's just not, even if we've got a really good therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So the emotion work part of it is really important. And then to kind of like take stock of how do I feel in my body, right? Is there a lot of chronic tension? Do I see a lot of inhibition in the way I breathe? Or that's something that is going to have to be addressed. And I think like just kind of like taking a balanced approach, whether it be kind of like, maybe you could try different things, see what resonates for you.
Yeah. Yeah. But how do you know when see, because the reason why I'm asking this is because for me everything sort of naturally unfolded. Like literally whatever you know, it's such a massive part of the journey has been exactly that, just expanding capacity to be with disturbing sensations and emotions. And just by virtue of being with those emotions fully, stuff was coming up. So like if something had a belief or story that had to be seen would reveal itself. So I never felt like I had to dig for anything. I
Yeah.
never had to like dig in my past or so, but I know for the fact that there are people who are so stuck in this,
Yeah.
where they feel like they need to resolve everything in order to awake. So
I didn't, I didn't have to go digging. Like once I kind of like, well, for me, discovering TRE really helped a lot because it,
Mhm.
first of all, um, I would say if you put in one sentence what TRE does, it gets you out of your head and into your body.
Yeah,
And
perfect.
then it just kind of like opens up that, like there's this word interoception, which is like the felt sense of the inner body. And it really, one of the things that it does is it helps you to become aware of the felt sense of the inner body.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's really important with emotion work. If you can't, if it's all a blank, right? How can you know what you're feeling, right? It's just very obscured. So doing some kind of body work, probably most people are going to need to do some kind of body work, I think,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, like
Mm-hmm.
something is going to be necessary. Um, here's something that I've heard, which I think is really good. If we think about it from this perspective, how do we know when we've done everything that we probably need to do, right? Like that. And that's a really good question to have if we're going into a therapy or modality, right? How do I know, right? What is the outcome that I should be looking for? And I think like this is really, really important. And I would say, and this isn't my own words, but something that I was, basically picked up in my own training.
Mm-hmm.
That was, you'll know when you feel safe in yourself and safe in the world. That's basically, sums it up very nicely.
For me, it's the emotional repression that was way more important than any kind of looking for trauma or because I didn't feel traumatized. I've been really impacted by my childhood in my nervous system massively. Okay. So it had a traumatizing effect,
Yeah.
right? But that to me is different to like the trauma with capital T. To me, the key was the really allowing for the emotions that have been repressed to come out and become more and more uncomfortable with them. Like honestly, like and when I say this sometimes to like people that I'm seeing one-on-one, it's almost like I literally see these baffled faces, like it can't be this simple. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because like in particular, if they come from like traditions or paths or models that make it sound like it's such a complicated process, it sounds like it's too simple. But then I go, well, give it a try. Next time you feel anxiety,
Yeah.
like give it a
Yeah.
try. When you
Yeah.
feel like rage arising or some kind, give it. It's
Yeah.
actually just because it sounds simple, it doesn't mean that it's easy, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing I spend a lot of time trying to just kind of like educate people on doing the emotion work, right? And so a lot of times people will say, okay, I'm here to do emotion work. Please help me,
Yeah.
and they have this expectation is like big cathartic experiences, I want to get to that repressed rage, right? Please help me. And I say, look, okay, what you need to understand is you got to start with the emotions that are there now. And you've got to work with that. Like, so what I mean by that is, let's just say you start to attune to what's going on. That's the step one. Like, how do you feel, right? Pay attention to your state and see how it kind of shifts, over time. And you're going to start to see something that if you pay attention, that you're going to see how you are habitually repressing emotion, lower levels of emotion. So there's no way you're going to be able to kind of like do like,
Yeah.
but like, for example, like let's just say, it's early afternoon, you started off the day is really good, you've gone for a walk, and out of nowhere, a feeling of loneliness starts to come into your experience. Well, most people, what they're going to do with that is go, what's going wrong? And they're going to think, okay, what do I do? How do I fix this?
Yes.
Right? Rather than just recognize, oh, I don't need to understand it. I don't need to do anything other than just let myself feel this. Right? That's it. That's it. Right? And to realize, like, that's basically the essence of emotion work is just kind of like giving it the space to just come up into your awareness without pushing it, without trying to manage it or do anything. Yeah. And then what you're going to see is that now you've got this capacity, it's like an invitation, right? And you gain confidence that, I can handle it, right? And
Yes.
then what you're going to see is that you're going to get more and more confidence, and you're going to see that it will be very natural, but it's a process. It takes people a bit of time to kind of just learn how to just be with it without jumping to the mind, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
try to come up with a strategy. And I had to do this too. Like I saw that tendency to repress, even for me, like just like going back to when I learned TRE, I was very lucky that I had a friend who actually taught me the basics of emotion work. And it was new to me, but it really helped with my own process just to learn how to, learn to be with whatever emotion is there, right? Whatever is coming up, try to trust it, right? Don't try to manage it, try to trust it.
Yeah.
And that I often tell people, look, reality is on your side. Reality wants to help you with the awakening process, right?
Yeah.
It's not trying to screw you over,
Yeah.
and whatever's happening, if you trust it, that it's right, it's there to help, you're gonna have a lot easier time with this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting because it's actually there was a point, and this is where it gets so like thin, this resistance to discomfort, where there was a point at which if you had asked me, do I resist any emotions, whatever, I would say no.
Mhm.
Total openness, and that would be true. And yet there was still the tiniest, tiniest, like looking for a point at which nothing else is going to arise. So even though there
Yeah.
was total openness, I still had this belief or some kind of idea floating around that there
Mhm.
was going to be a point at which nothing is going to arise anymore. And that's
Yeah.
how I discovered that the resistance was still in operation,
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's vast, in like the
Oh.
the layers of that resistance to discomfort are and like we were talking earlier, the mind can literally hijack everything and use it as a way to fool ourselves to thinking that we're so
Yeah.
open and like so okay with
Oh,
everything,
I
right?
know. I know. I know. It never ceases to amaze me, and I, on a regular basis, it's like the awakening, it is kind of, it's like a light, right? It's kind of like a light that is kind of like illuminating everything that has been, well, seemingly hidden, from view. And when the light kind of like fully illuminates, you realize, oh, isn't that interesting? Like on some level, I knew it, but it wasn't kind of like being acknowledged, right? It's kind of weird, eh?
Yes, because we're talking about emotions.
Oh,
And you said
yes.
like what's different? And I would say that I think there's just such a fundamental sameness to all experience that
Yep.
therefore I don't even care how I feel. Like I don't care if I feel, low or angry or irritated or whatever. It's like there, so that's definitely what came to an end. It's like the end of preference to how I feel. I don't care how I feel. I feel how I feel.
Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
it's full
Yeah.
blown, right?
There's like an underlying peace,
Yes.
no matter what, no matter what, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Chris, thank you so much. There's just the trouble with these topics is like, you know, it's so vast. I mean, the
Oh, we
nuance
could
and
probably talk for another 3 hours, I think.
easily, and it's just like this is the trouble to even like structure it because like I still want to go to in so many directions, but I still very much enjoy this conversation.